My father told the neighbors that Finn had wandered outside on his own. That was the story he was counting on. 3 hours after my son disappeared into that blizzard, the nurse coordinator at Sick Kids called me. 1 hour after that, my father walked through the sliding doors of the emergency wing, and when he turned the corner and saw me standing by the observation glass of the pediatric trauma room, dry, composed, and watching him with the stillness of someone who has spent years studying people who think they've gotten away with something, his whole body went rigid. His chin dropped. He backed into a triage cart and asked me, in a voice that had lost all its usual authority, how on earth I had gotten there so fast. Before I tell you what my father allowed to happen to a 9-year-old boy on the coldest night of a January in Ontario, and before I tell you how I made sure he lost absolutely everything, I want to know where you're watching from. Tell me in the comments. And if you've ever had to protect your own peace from the people who were supposed to protect you first, hit the like button and come with me, because this is going to be a long one. My name's Chloe. I'm 31 years old. For 6 years, I worked as a financial crimes investigator with the RCMP out of the Ontario division, and for the last 3, I've run a private forensic accounting firm. We hold federal contracts and work for Bay Street law firms that need someone quiet, thorough, and invisible. My family thought I was on a client review in Calgary. They thought I was 3 provinces away. They thought they had the weekend. Finn is my son. He's 9, curious about absolutely everything, terrible at sitting still, and he has a respiratory condition that flares badly in extreme cold. I had arranged for him to stay at my parents' property in Oakville, a 6-bedroom house on the lake that my father has spent 4 decades presenting to the world as proof of his success, for one weekend while I closed out a sensitive review. It was supposed to be safe. My father is a real estate developer who has spent his entire career cultivating the image of a family patriarch who could be trusted. That image was the only thing he ever truly cared about. The wind chill that Friday night dropped to -31. The nurse on the phone told me Finn had been brought in by a passing driver who found him collapsed in a snowbank less than 50 meters from the property gate. His core temperature had dropped dangerously low. His airway was inflamed and closing. They had stabilized him but were monitoring closely. I was already at the airport before she finished the sentence. When I arrived at the hospital, I stood outside Finn's room and looked at my son through the observation glass. He was small in that bed. He had an IV in one arm and a warming blanket pulled to his chin, and his face was still pale in the way that takes your breath away when you're a mother. I pressed my hand flat against the cold glass and held it there. I have a particular kind of training that most people don't understand unless they've done it. You learn, over years of field work, how to set your grief aside like you're setting down a cup of tea. Not forever, just temporarily. You hold it, you acknowledge it, and then you place it somewhere safe so your hands are free. I placed it, I cleared my head, and I started thinking. My phone had 2 messages I hadn't answered. One from my father, sent 90 minutes after Finn was admitted. He said there had been a misunderstanding, that Finn had gotten out during a moment when he'd stepped away. One from my sister, sent 40 minutes after that, telling me not to overreact and that the doctors were almost certainly making it worse than it was. Neither of them had asked whether Finn was going to be okay. I heard my father before I saw him. His shoes, heavy leather Oxfords, the same pair he's worn to every important event of his life, make a particular sound on polished hospital floors. He walked in with his posture straight and his coat perfectly pressed, like a man arriving to sign paperwork on a property acquisition rather than to check on his hospitalized grandchild. He spoke to the nurse at the front desk with the calm confidence that comes from decades of assuming every room will bend around you. Then he turned and saw me. Everything about him changed in the span of half a second. His shoulders pulled back, then dropped. His mouth opened without producing sound. He took a step backward and his heel caught the leg of a waiting room chair. He said my name like it was a question. I walked toward him slowly. I stopped when I was close enough that he couldn't respond at normal volume without the whole ward hearing. I asked him why my son was in the ICU. He tried to recover. He told me Finn had been making trouble all evening. He said my brother-in-law had caught Finn going through private documents in the study, and that when my nephew had tried to intervene, Finn had knocked something over and caused a scene. He said he'd sent Finn to the front porch to calm down, and that it wasn't his fault the boy had wandered off through the gate. He said these words, with the same flat certainty he uses when correcting a contractor's quote, He used the word wandered about a 9-year-old in -30 weather. I did not raise my voice. I told him the initial report noted that the gate latch had been secured from the inside. I told him there was a difference between a child who got lost and a child who was put outside and left there. He waved his hand. He said I was being dramatic. He said children are resilient, that a little cold never hurt anyone, and that perhaps if I spent less time in Calgary and more time parenting, Finn wouldn't have been in someone else's house causing problems. Every word was another entry in a file I was already building. The elevator opened. My sister stepped out in a cream wool coat, a leather bag over one arm, followed by my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law is a real estate lawyer. He has been with my sister for 8 years and spent every one of those years making it quietly clear that he considered himself the most sophisticated person in any room he entered. He walked slightly ahead of her, the way men do when they want to signal that they're managing the situation. Neither of them glanced at the window where Finn was sleeping. My sister told me I needed to calm down. My brother-in-law told me in a low and practiced voice that this had been an unfortunate incident but that my father had acted in good faith. He said Finn had been caught attempting to access private documents, irreplaceable originals, and that my father had made a reasonable decision about discipline. He said that if I was going to make accusations against the family, he would have no choice but to involve their legal team. Then he reached into his coat and placed a check on the arm of the chair beside me. $40,000. He told me to use it for the medical bills and anything else I needed with one condition. I was not to speak further with the police, not to make any public statements, and not to pursue the matter. He said if I chose not to accept his generosity, he had a contact at the Children's Aid Society and could make a call in the morning suggesting that my care arrangement warranted review. He said it the way people say things when they've practiced saying them. Calm, almost kind. I looked at the check. I looked at the routing number at the bottom. The account was not from any Canadian chartered bank. The institution name was a private registry number I recognized from a FinTrack advisory I'd reviewed 8 months earlier, a flagged offshore vehicle tied to a money laundering pattern involving GTA real estate transactions. I picked up the check by its edge, preserving the surface. I folded it and put it in my pocket. My brother-in-law seemed satisfied with that. My sister gave me a look that was supposed to read as sympathy. They left. I walked to the stairwell, pulled out my phone, and called Tyler. Tyler had been with RCMP Financial Crimes longer than I had before going private, and he ran the analytical side of my firm now. He answered in 2 rings. I gave him the routing number. He was quiet for about 4 seconds. Then he said he knew exactly which registry it was tied to and that he'd been watching transactions move through it for months. I told him about the Oakville property and asked him to pull every camera feed from the last 48 hours. He said he'd have something in under an hour. He called back in 45 minutes. The security system on my father's property was a standard commercial setup, the kind with a cloud backup the owner doesn't know exists. Tyler walked me through the footage while I stood with my back against the concrete wall of the hospital stairwell. Finn had woken up because of the noise from the heating system struggling against the cold. He'd gone looking for his grandfather, the way children do when they're in an unfamiliar house in the dark. He'd pushed open the door to the study. My sister and my brother-in-law were inside. Documents were spread across the desk. The camera in the corner was angled at the room's entrance. Tyler said the image was clear enough to see my sister holding a pen above a signature line. When Finn walked in, my brother-in-law moved first. He swept the documents into a bag. My sister stood up. They both stared at Finn the way people stare when they've been caught doing something they cannot explain. Then my nephew, their son, 12 years old and built like his father, pushed past Finn from the hallway and grabbed him by the arm. The footage showed Finn being dragged toward the back of the house. It showed the rear door being opened. It showed Finn being shoved out into the dark and the snow. It showed my nephew closing the door and sliding the latch. My brother-in-law watched from the study doorway. He did not intervene. He turned back to his documents. Tyler told me he'd flagged 3 things in the financial trail attached to that routing number. The account was a hub for a network of numbered companies, all registered in British Columbia, all tied to transactions involving my father's development firm. Dirty money was being run through property flips and construction invoices, cleaned by volume and velocity. Tyler estimated the total moving through that system in the last 18 months was somewhere above $12 million. The documents my sister had been signing. Tyler had pulled a frame from the footage and run it through document recognition, appeared to be assignment of beneficial ownership forms. They were transferring my father's interest in 4 properties, without his knowledge, into my brother-in-law's numbered companies. My father was being robbed by the son-in-law he'd welcomed like a gift. I told Tyler to compile everything and stand by. In the morning, 2 things arrived at the hospital within 20 minutes of each other. The first was a lawyer, a senior partner from the firm my father uses for his personal affairs, who handed me a stack of documents and informed me that my father had, effective that morning, amended his will. I had been removed entirely. He had left me with what the lawyer called deliberate specificity, $1. He explained that the $1 bequest was a legal formality to prove intent to exclude rather than accidental omission. He said it with the practiced neutrality of a man who has delivered a lot of bad news and learned not to make eye contact during it. The second was a text from my sister. She had posted to her social media accounts. She has around 300,000 followers in the lifestyle space, a statement saying she was concerned for my well-being, that Finn's hospitalization had been the result of a difficult situation involving a family member who had been struggling, and that she was praying for healing. She didn't name me. She didn't need to. People who knew our family would know exactly who she meant. I sat with Finn for a while after that. He was awake, groggy, his voice still rough at the edges. He held my hand and stared at the sea. Then he told me he was sorry for causing problems. It took everything I had to keep my voice steady. I told him he had not caused a single problem. I told him what happened was not his fault and would never be his fault. He nodded slowly, the way children do when they want to believe you but aren't quite sure yet. Then he turned his head and told me that my brother-in-law had leaned down, before my nephew dragged him to the door, and told him something. He said my brother-in-law told him I wasn't coming back from my work trip, that I'd gotten tired of being his mother and had moved away for good. My brother-in-law had said this to a 9-year-old boy before sending him out into a blizzard. I kissed Finn's forehead and told him that was a lie. I told him there was no version of any world in which I would ever stop coming back for him. I told him to rest. Then I walked to the waiting room, found a quiet corner, and called Tyler again. I told him it was time. I told him to forward the full dossier to the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit contact and to FinTrack directly. I also gave him one additional instruction. Pull every financial document connecting my father's firm to my brother-in-law's numbered companies, cross-referenced against the last 4 years of property transfers, and flag anything associated with Finn's name. Tyler called back in 2 hours. He was quiet for a moment before he told me. There was a federally registered trust in Finn's full legal name, including his social insurance number, incorporated under one of my brother-in-law's companies 3 months earlier. The trust held no real assets. It existed as a liability shield, a layer of separation between the laundered funds and my brother-in-law's direct exposure. If the RCMP ever followed the money far enough, the trail would end at my 9-year-old son's name. There was also a forged signature on the incorporation documents. It was mine. My brother-in-law had planned this carefully. He had used my son as a legal buffer for his crimes and forged my credentials to make me the co-author. If investigators ever surfaced the fraud, he would produce those documents and claim I had used my forensic accounting background and federal contacts to run the scheme, hiding it under Finn's identity. He would walk. I would be finished. He had not planned for me to be the one doing the forensics. I sent Tyler the final confirmation to transmit everything. I had enough to end this cleanly inside the system, with documentation that would be bulletproof in a federal courtroom. But I didn't just want a legal outcome. I wanted the people who had built their entire lives on my father's blind trust and my family's silence to lose that silence in front of everyone who had ever believed their performance. My father's development company was holding its anniversary gala that evening at a hotel in downtown Toronto. 300 guests, city councilors, developers, investors, local media. My brother-in-law was being formally named managing partner. My father had planned it for months. It was supposed to be the crowning moment of everything he'd built. It was going to be something else entirely. I went home, changed into a black blazer and slacks, and drove downtown. Tyler had accessed the venue's AV system remotely earlier in the day. He had the audio file ready, a phone call my brother-in-law had made to a business associate 9 weeks earlier, recorded through Tyler's monitoring of the flagged account. In the recording, my brother-in-law described, in his own voice and with obvious satisfaction, exactly how he had used my father's firm to run the laundering operation. He laughed as he said it. He said my father was the easiest man in the world to manage, because all you had to do was tell him what he wanted to hear and give him someone to look down on when things went wrong. He said the daughter, me, had been the perfect answer to that for years, because no one in that family would ever take my side over his. He used words I won't repeat here, about my father, about what he actually thought of the man who had given him everything. The ballroom was warm and golden when I arrived. White tablecloths, tall centerpieces, a jazz quartet in the corner. My father was at the podium mid-speech. He was talking about legacy and the importance of family. I walked down the center aisle without hurrying. People turned. The music didn't stop, but it might as well have. My father saw me from the stage and his hands tightened on the podium edges. My brother-in-law was at the head table. He stood up when he saw me. My sister reached for his arm. I stopped at the front of the room and looked at my brother-in-law with the same expression I use when presenting findings to a federal tribunal. I told the room, calmly, clearly, that before my father announced his new managing partner, the guests deserved to hear something that managing partner had said about this company and about my father when he thought no one was listening. My brother-in-law said I was having a breakdown. He said it loudly for the room. He asked for security. I gave Tyler the signal. The room's speakers came to life. My brother-in-law's voice filled the entire ballroom. His own words, his own laughter, his own careful description of how he'd been moving money through my father's legitimate properties for years, and what he truly thought of the man he called his father-in-law in public. The room went absolutely still. My father gripped the podium and did not move. My brother-in-law attempted to speak when the recording ended. He said it was fabricated, a deep fake, evidence I had manufactured using my RCMP background. He pointed at me and used words like extortion and defamation. Not one person at any of those tables moved toward him. My sister pushed back her chair and began to cry in the immediate, practiced way that has always worked for her in family situations. But the faces in that room weren't looking at her with sympathy. 300 people had just listened to her husband describe my father as a vain and manageable fool. My father stepped down from the stage. He walked to his CFO, who was seated nearby, and told him in a low voice to pull up the company accounts immediately. The CFO opened his laptop. He typed his credentials. He tried again. He looked up at my father and his face had gone completely pale. Tyler had already coordinated with the RCMP to initiate a temporary freeze on the operating accounts as part of the criminal investigation. My father's corporate lines, his personal accounts linked to the firm, his property management portals, all locked, pending federal review. My father turned slowly and looked at me from across the room. He looked older than he had at the hospital. He looked like a man who had just realized that the ground beneath him was not his. The RCMP arrived before he could reach me. 4 officers came through the side entrance and they walked directly to my brother-in-law. The lead officer identified himself, read the charges, and placed my brother-in-law's hands behind his back with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done this many times. My brother-in-law looked at my sister. She had stopped crying. She was looking at her hands. My father came to me after my brother-in-law had been taken through the side door. The remaining guests had not left. They were watching the way people watch when they can't look away. My father stopped a few feet from me. He looked at my face for a long moment, then he asked me to help him. He offered me everything, the company, the Oakville property, control of the accounts. He said he would put my name on all of it, today, right now. He just needed me to call someone, to use my contacts, to stop this before it went further. I thought about Finn in that hospital bed telling me he was sorry for causing problems. I reached into my jacket pocket and held out my open palm. Sitting in it was a single loonie, a $1 coin, the kind every Canadian carries in the bottom of every coat pocket. I had taken it from the change bowl in my car on the way downtown. I told my father that his lawyer had been very clear that morning. He had left me $1, deliberately, to prove it was not an oversight but a choice. I turned his hand over and placed the loonie in his palm. I told him to keep it. It was the only currency he had left that wasn't frozen, seized, or under federal review. I told him I hoped it was enough to remind him what his choices had cost. I folded his fingers around it and walked out of the ballroom. The weeks that followed were quieter than what came before. The RCMP investigation moved quickly, Tyler's documentation was airtight, and my brother-in-law's decision to use a child's social insurance number as a fraud shield did not make the federal prosecutors feel inclined toward leniency. He pleaded guilty to avoid trial. He was sentenced to 11 years at a federal institution. My sister lost the Oakville access, the investment accounts, and the lifestyle that had required both of those things to exist. She moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Mississauga. The last I heard, she was working at a property management office. She hasn't contacted me. I don't expect she will. My father did not recover the way I think he expected to. The fraud had run deeper than he wanted to acknowledge, not just in the financial records, but in the realization that he had spent years protecting someone who was stealing from him, while dismissing the daughter who could have stopped it. A friend of the family told me without being asked that he still had the loonie. He kept it in his coat pocket. I didn't know what to do with that information, so I filed it away. My mother never quite explained herself. I didn't push. Some silences are not worth filling. Finn came home 12 days after that January night. He walked through my front door in his dinosaur socks and asked if we could have pancakes. I said yes. We made them together and ate them standing at the kitchen counter because neither of us wanted to wait long enough to set the table. His respiratory specialist confirmed full recovery by the end of February. I kept the house in Oakville eventually. Not to preserve anything my father had built there, I stripped it back and started over. New paint. Finn's drawings taped to the walls. A dog who sleeps at the foot of his bed and barks at the lake wind in the mornings. There is a version of this story where I tell you it was worth it because justice was served and the right people faced consequences. That version is true. But the version that matters more is the one where my son walks to the window in the morning and looks at the water and knows, in whatever way 9-year-olds know things, that no one in this house will ever use him to protect themselves. That is the thing I built. That is the thing I kept. If you've had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your child safe, if you know what it costs to be the one who finally says enough, I'd really like to hear from you in the comments. Subscribe and share this with anyone who needs to hear that protecting what actually matters is never the wrong choice.